Okay, hi. So I figured some of you may want to know how I've been making my beautiful breads. Here's one I prepared earlier, isn't she a beauty? So I'm going to take you through the step-by-step process that I go through when I'm making my bread. I've just got plain white flour. I actually have baker's flour, which wasn't a huge investment. It was at Coles, but I only have one type of flour. I haven't explored outside of that. I got my mixing bowl, and I've got my beautiful fresh starter that you can see is all bubbly. Can you see on the outside there? It's all bubbly. That means that it's already, what does it mean? It basically means that it's a mature starter. It's ready to use. So I fed it this morning. And I've probably been feeding it every 18 to 24 hours for the past couple of days to keep it nice and fresh. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use my digital scale here, very important investment for a bread baker, and I'm going to measure out 40 grams of my starter. And if you're not sure if your starter is healthy enough and ready to cook with, you can always try the float test where you just drop a little dollop in a piece of water and see if it floats. And if it floats, it's ready. So I take that 40 grams of starter and then I get 30 grams of water, and I just keep zeroing so I don't have to keep numbers in my head. 30 grams of water, and then I measure out about 30 grams of my white flour. There we go. And then you mix it all together, and that's called the leaven. And I leave it for about 2 hours for it to mature, and I put the rest of the starter back in the fridge for the next loaf of bread. So I'm going to set my timer for 2 hours. So this is what the leaven should look like before it has matured. And this is where Google Home comes in great handy. Okay, Google, set a timer for 2 hours.
Okay, 2 hours, starting now.
Hi again. So that's 2 hours done. So now it's time for the next phase. We've got our mature leaven here, and I think this is called autolysis or autolysis. I've only ever seen it on blogs, so I have no idea how it's pronounced. Basically, you need your mature leaven, and you need some water, which should be at 28 to 30 degrees temperature. I just have a little meat thermometer that I shove in this bottle of kind of warm tap water, and make sure that it's been between 28 and 30 degrees. And the reason that's important is it kind of helps make everything move around. It kind of helps make the process, I guess, and the starter kind of ferment. So we just zero out our digital, can't speak English anymore. So we zero out our digital scale. I've got the mature leaven in there. I pour in about 375 grams of water is what I use when I'm using the plain baker's flour. If you're using different flour, sometimes you need a little bit more water, but you'll see the consistency of the dough and you'll know if you've got the right amount of water. Now I'm doing all things wrong for this video because I think my bowl's going to end up being too small, because now what I need to do is I need to add about 500 grams of my flour, which is much more than you think it is. It's half the sack, obviously. Oh, actually, before I do that, again, I've done it wrong. So before I do that, I mix the water and the leaven together to loosen it up a little bit and to make sure that that leaven isn't really stuck to the bottom of the bowl, so it doesn't mix through well. So then your water turns into like this kind of creamy, a bit frothy almost. And you use your hands because otherwise everything gets stuck to a spoon and it doesn't really mix very well. So now we add in our 500 grams of flour. And we just keep going and going, and then once you've added in all the flour, the best thing to do is just use your hands again. It's going to get really sticky and really messy, but that's what making bread is all about. If everything in your house isn't covered in weird bits of dough at the end of it, you haven't made it right. That's my theory anyway. So I've got probably 2 more scoops to go. I'm at 480. Oh, it's just going to fit in this bowl. Right, so that's 500 grams of flour. So now I'm just going to stir it together. And the best thing to do is just slowly mix the flour in with the liquid. And I don't know if you can see what's going on here. Does that work better? There you go. Just slowly mixing it in, and it really is a big sticky mess, and you think, how could this ever be bread? It's not sifted, it's going to be all lumpy. If you made a cake like this, you were probably right, it would be all lumpy. But yeah, I just keep mixing it through until I end up with a kind of batter looking kind of dough. And I always scrape down the sides at the end because you don't want any weird like flour pieces getting stuck into the bread. So it doesn't really matter too much if you kind of breaking things at this point. There's a point when you're doing dough folding where you really want to be careful that you're not breaking the kind of the dough apart, but at this stage it really doesn't matter. So you can see it's a big sticky gross mess and it's all over my fingers. Nothing a bit of hot water won't fix. And now I just get my icing paddle. Again, I don't know any of the right terms. I'm a COVID baker. So I get my paddle and I just scrape down the sides so that you don't end up with anything really stuck there. And you leave this dough just to sit at room temperature for another hour. And then it's just going to slightly mix together over that hour. So I guess at that point I will wash my hands and be back here again in an hour. Bye. Okay guys, so it's been an hour and now we're going to get the salt. So I just get a light container so you can measure out 10 grams of fine salt. And then just sprinkle it out over your dough that has sat there in that autolysis or autolysis phase. So looks like that, just sprinkled on top. And then use your thumb and your forefinger to kind of pinch the dough through. So you're kind of making, I don't know, like just mixing it by really like squeezing it. I just kind of go to make a fist once I've put my hand in the bowl, which is kind of gross. But do this a few times and you start to feel like the dough kind of goes tight. And when that's happening, that's kind of when you've done a really, you know, you've got it through, you're feeling it less grainy, can't feel the salt grains anymore, and the dough gets a bit tight. And so at that point we're going to stop and we're just going to gather the dough together by scraping down the edges like we did the last time, and then we're going to leave it for about 30 minutes. You don't have to cover it, you just leave it on the bench, and then we'll get to, I think, our first round of folding. Beautiful. So I'm just going to leave it, oh yuck, just going to leave it like that for about 30 minutes. Okay, so after half an hour, now it's time to stretch and fold. So our dough looks kind of like that, and I've got wet hands, and I'm going to push my fingers between the dough and the side of the bowl, and I'm going to grab the underside of the dough, stretch it slightly, and fold it over towards the opposite side. Can you see what I'm doing? Like I'm trying to make a square inside the bowl. So you just repeat this process probably about 8 times, just working your way around the bowl. But what you're trying to do is stretch out the fibers of the dough without kind of breaking them. So that's why it's like quite a gentle stretch and fold. And then after you've done this, probably about 8 times, you'll feel like the dough will feel less lumpy. And it's just all starting to really turn into a nice kind of ball as opposed to just being like fluid. Anyway. So after we've done this all the way around, then we put it to the side and we cover it this time and we leave it to rest for about another 30 minutes, and then we come back and we do the same thing again. So looking like that, I'll be right back in another 30 minutes. Okay, so all right. So now it's time to do the first shaping. So first you get to make a bit of mess. You always need to have your flour next to you at this stage because you never know when you need a bit more flour. Now I just make sure I've got a nice clean bench and I just lay a bunch of flour down, and then I get my little and I scrape the dough out. And normally I would use the spatula for the icing, but I've put it in the dishwasher already. So I'm just quite careful not to let it break too much. I'm trying to keep those gluten bonds together because we've done all that lovely work of folding the dough to try to make it all nice. So now that we've got that, we're just gonna fold the dough over itself a few times here, just to kind of get it coated in flour so it's a little bit easier to move. And then pushing the dough around from different angles. Now you can use a dough scraper, look I've got one here, but you don't really have to. And so you're just kind of doing this, it's sticking to the table a little bit, that's really normal, that's kind of the consistency you want. And you just want to just keep moving it around until you start to feel it a little bit, get a little bit firmer. And then we're going to put the folds down and just kind of tighten it up until you end up with like a nice little flat and tight little pocket of dough here. It's not my prettiest dough, but that will do. So it's been 20 minutes, you can see it's relaxed a little bit now. So what your next step is, now we're going to do our final shaping before it goes in the proving basket. So I've got one of these fancy little proving baskets, which is a mixed blessing because the first time that I used it, all the dough got stuck and it was an absolute disaster. What I do is I flour it first and I use a little bit of white flour, probably about 50-50 white flour and 50-50 rice flour. And the reason is that the rice flour, I think it just has like slightly harder particles, and so it actually clings on really, really well. When I use just flour, it has gotten stuck before. It also is the thing that is responsible for those beautiful rings around the final loaf of bread. When you see those flour rings in my loaves, that's where it comes from. You can just use a normal bowl. My first few loaves, I didn't have any of these fancy accessories because they were a Mother's Day present. So I used to just pop the dough for the final prove in a bowl, and I just oiled it with a bit of olive oil on the outside. It actually does give the dough a really nice kind of crust on it when you've used the oiling in the bowl. So I just tap the flour around until it gets all around the basket. Use more than you think. It's better to be safe than sorry in this instance because you really don't want your dough to get stuck, because the last thing you do is take the dough out of this basket when you're about to bake it. So just put the excess there. So I've got a beautiful floured proving basket ready to go. So now I've got my lovely floured dough here, and I'm just going to lay out a bit more flour. And what you're doing now is you kind of loosen the dough from the bench so it's easy to move and you're not kind of tearing it. And then I flip it over. So I've got I know that the bottom bit is all really well floured. And so what I do now is I take the top of the dough and I fold it down towards the center. And then I do the same with this bit, folding until I make like a little square. And you'll feel the dough's kind of like pillowy soft. It's actually really lovely. And what you're doing here is you're kind of getting all of the air out of the bread without tearing or ripping the dough at all. So now I've got my little bundle here. Now I do it again, but I do it with the corners. And I grab first I'm gonna grab one corner, stretch it slightly, fold it into the center, and do it here. And once you've done that, you kind of have created like a little tucked bundle. Can you see that looks like a little tucked bundle? And so I'm going to take those seams at the bottom and I'm going to make sure I've got flour there and quickly flip it over. And then I've got my beautiful little ball. And I'm going to tighten up a little bit with the dough scraper. And if I just tie it like that, it kind of tightens a little bit into a lovely little ball. And now that okay, so my dough has been proving in the basket on the bench for an hour and a half. So we're going to have a look. You can see it's almost full to the top of this proving basket. So it's risen nicely. So what we're going to do is we're going to put the dough in the refrigerator. You don't have to cover it unless you think that the dough is a bit too dry. I cover it just so that people in my family don't drop things on top of it. And it goes in the fridge, and it can be in the fridge for anywhere from 12 to 24 hours. Basically, the fridge shuts down the rising process, and it just sits there kind of in hiatus until you're ready to bake. And so I'm going to put this one in the fridge overnight so that I've got a freshly baked loaf of bread for the kids' school lunches tomorrow morning. So I'll be back tomorrow morning ready to put this girl in the oven. Good morning, everyone. So our bread should be ready now. So it's still in the fridge and I leave it there until my oven is hot and I'm just about to cook it. So what I've got is a lovely Le Creuset cast iron pot, and I use that in my oven so that it creates a really moist environment for the dough to grow in, and I can make sure it gets super hot. Now this is 28 centimeters in diameter, and it has a plastic lid, and the plastic lid has been badly damaged by me using it in my very hot oven, and I've also probably stained the inside of it by having a very hot oven. So do use something that you don't love when you're baking like this, or do what I've just done and purchase a replacement pot knob for your Le Creuset, which is made of stainless steel, which is much more durable and can manage the heat of 250 degrees, which is what the oven is at when you first heat it up. So what you do now to get started is turn the oven on to 250 degrees, or really as hot as the oven goes. I always take the lid off and I put the two pieces in the oven like that on the bottom rack, so that there's room enough to put the lid on afterwards. And I set a timer for an hour, and then I come back when it's time to bake. So I'm going to put this in the oven, and I will, the very loud oven, and I will see you guys in an hour. Okay, so we're in a different spot in the kitchen now because I've got my cast iron pot, it's been in the oven for about an hour. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take the bread out of the fridge. It's been in there overnight. So here's my bread. Let's see what it looks like. Just as beautiful as it was when I put it to sleep, which is exactly how you want it to be. So I'm just going to leave this here on the counter, and then I'm going to take the pot out of the oven. It's really important. It's going to be really hot because the oven's been at its hottest. So I'm going to take it out and put it on the bench, put the lid on top of it, and make it nice and hot. And I keep the pot holders over it, so I make sure I don't forget that it's boiling hot when I go to put the lid back on and the bread in. So now what we need to do is we need to sprinkle a thin layer of flour on the underside of the dough, this bit that's facing up. Now sometimes I use a bit of semolina because I find that it sticks less. And you know, sometimes when you buy bread in the shops, you see it's got like that bit of that orange crust on the bottom. That's semolina, so it tends to work a bit better for me, but whatever you prefer. It's a little bit like that, so it slides in and out of the board. Now we flip it over. I just use a chopping board, but you could use lightly floured baking paper. I find this is the best way to do it for me, and then I can just take this paddle board and slide the bread into the cast iron pot when it's ready. So what we want to do is we want the dough to come out of this proving basket, and then we're going to score it. And scoring it is kind of creating a cut in the dough that gives it a weak point where it can expand. And it just means that if you didn't do it, it probably would still expand, but it would expand all over the place rather than in these key weak points that you've created. All right, this is not, you saw how much flour and rice flour and everything I put in the proving basket before I proved this. So this is very annoying that it's not coming out more easily than this. Sometimes it comes out easily, sometimes I guess it's a little bit trickier. Let's see if, come on, here she comes. Okay, we've got one half out, gently. Now you don't want to muck this up too much because this is again where those beautiful flour lines come from. So you'll see once I get this basket off what the dough looks like. Oh, there's just one little point that's stuck. Come on, baby, come on. All right, here she goes. So there's my beautiful bread. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to score it, and today I'm going to do a cross score. And I use a very sharp knife. People have this thing called a lame or something, which is like a blade on a little stick. But I find just a really sharp knife that I've got in my kitchen works really well. You're just doing about half half a centimetre little slits in the bread, and that's it. Now it's time to go in the oven, and we do this nice and quick so the pot stays super warm. I'm just going to see if I can get you guys to see this. Can you see I'm just sliding it into the cast iron pot, and I try to do it as smoothly as possible so that it doesn't get smushed, but sometimes it does go a bit skewy, and that's okay too. Now it goes in the oven, and the timer goes on with the lid on, and the timer goes on for 20 minutes. Okay, Google, turn the timer on for 20 minutes. All right, so excuse my camera angle, it's been 20 minutes. So what we're going to do is we're going to open the oven, and we're going to take the lid off the pot, and then we're going to keep it cooking for another 20 minutes, but this time with the lid off. So what I'm expecting to see when I open the cast iron pot is that the dough has risen nicely and it's the right size, and then I take the lid off for it to get nice and crunchy. See that beauty? Don't know if you can see it, but it's looking lovely. So lid off, I turn the oven down a little bit. I think I've got it at about, it's hard to tell with my oven, but it started at 240 degrees and now it's at 230 degrees. So just turning it down slightly for the next 20 minutes so it gets a nice deep golden crust. Okay, so that's 20 minutes up. Hi, and by now, your whole house should smell like beautiful fresh bread. Now it's up to you if you want to just take it out straight away at the 20-minute mark, or if you want to leave it to get a bit crustier and darker. Because I want to finish making this video, I'm just going to take it out now. So I can turn the oven off so it's not blowing in my face when I open the door. And we should have an absolute beauty on our hands. Special shout out to Carolyn Block and Max Davis for these gorgeous pot holders, because it's very hot when I'm playing around with my bread. So look at that gorgeous bread. It's absolutely delicious. It's split exactly where I cut it. It's gotten some little, I think they're called ears, when it kind of creeps up like that and gets really crunchy. The flour lines have stayed there and it's grown really nicely. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take it out of the Le Creuset carefully. I just use my hands because if it hasn't stuck to the bottom, it should be very easy, and pop it on this cooling rack until it is ready to eat. And that's it. That's how you make bread. I know it seems like a really long process, and it is. So you kind of do it on a day when you're going to be working from home, and you can just slowly do the steps every hour or every 20 minutes. Now, if your bread came out and was really flat, the only thing I can think of is it's probably over fermented when it was in the proving basket on the bench. For that, I think it was an hour and a half or an hour that we proved it for. So if it's flat, that's probably happened. It's done too much rising before, and so there wasn't any strength left to expand in the oven. So next time, try shortening that period of time on the bench, or make sure that your oven's cold enough that it actually did stop the growing in the oven, or put it higher in the oven where it's hotter, where it's cooler, I mean, so that you make sure that that proving really doesn't happen before it gets in the oven, too much rising. So that's it. Let me know if you've got any more questions, or you want to see me do this again in a different outfit, because I did realise that the early videos you can see my big W tracksuit pants, so sorry about that. But thanks for sticking with me. I hope you've got a beautiful loaf of bread just like this at the very end. I can't wait to cut into it.